In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. My brothers and sisters, welcome to our study of the book of Exodus. Today we're going to look at Exodus chapter 12, which recounts to us one of the most important events in the entire Old Testament, the Passover of the Lord. I cannot underestimate how important Exodus 12 is. We're actually going to do two videos on this chapter because it will help us to understand the Last Supper in the New Testament and the crucifixion of Christ. So, just to give a little bit of background before we go into Exodus chapter 12, you really have to read Exodus chapter 11, which is a very short chapter. It's a very short chapter. And if you remember, the plagues came in groups of three. So if you go back and look at the plagues, they came in groups of three. First, there was the blood, the frogs, and the lice. That was group one. Then there was swarms of flies, pestilence, and boils. That was group two. Then there was hail, locusts, and darkness for 3 days over the land of Egypt. That was group three. Three strikes and you're out, right? Well, the next event that happened after that was the death of the firstborn. It was the Passover. And of course, this plague is going to basically bring to completion all the plagues. Notice that there's 10 plagues altogether. The number 10 is important. Israel will receive 10 commandments from the Lord. The Lord will test his people 10 times, and they will murmur and rebel against the Lord 10 times as well. So the number 10 comes up again and again during the Exodus. You can find more about this if you go to Numbers chapter 14. So just a little bit of a recap from Exodus chapter 11. The Lord talks about one more plague. So, really, Exodus chapter 11, it's preparing us for chapter 12. The two chapters are kind of tied together. And so he talks about after the 3 days of darkness, one more plague is going to come upon the land of Egypt. And the Lord, before that plague, he gave his people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. This sense of giving his people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, it's really interesting because you might remember how he blessed Sarai and Abram when they left Egypt in Genesis chapter 12. They kind of left with favor in Genesis 12. And then again, Abraham and Sarah left the kingdom of Abimelech with great wealth in Genesis 20. So you see them leaving with favor. Isaac and Rebekah prospered in the kingdom of Abimelech. And then Jacob left Laban with great wealth, 4 times leaving with great wealth and favor. Well, it kind of is preparing us for the Exodus. These four events that I just mentioned really are preparing us for Exodus chapter 11. The people had such great favor in the sight of the Egyptians that the Egyptians gave them precious objects, okay? They especially gave them gold earrings. And this was all going to be used for the sanctuary. But what did they first use it for? Making the golden calf. They misused all this that they received because they were given great favor in the sight of the Egyptians. So the Egyptians are giving them all these objects of wealth, and they want to send them away wealthy. Isn't that beautiful? How God blessed his people in the sight of the Egyptians. And as I said before, you can find four events in Genesis 12, 20, Genesis 26, and Genesis 31, 30 to 31, where a similar situation happened for the patriarchs. And this is not an accident. Many scholars will say that you can see the outline of the Exodus again and again in the book of Genesis. Okay. I go through this in my tapes on the book of Genesis if you want to look at the playlist and go through those tapes. So the Lord talks about how the firstborn will die. They're going to die in the middle of the night. It's going to occur in the middle of the night. So Israel will celebrate the Passover. The firstborn will die in the middle of the night. and there will be a great crying out in the land of Egypt. And this is going to be really dramatic if you think about it. And at the same time, there will be a great contrast. So the prophecy is that a great crying out will take place in the land of Egypt, but not even a dog would bark or growl in the land of Goshen where Israel dwells. So you can really see a contrast between the crying out in the land of Egypt when the firstborn die and the complete peace in the land of Goshen, where not even a dog will bark or growl. And so, what will happen? The Pharaoh will not listen to Moses. And God has even hardened the Pharaoh's heart to his own decision so that he can manifest his salvation. All this sets us up for chapter 12. And so we're going to read through chapter 12. And then in the second video, I'm going to walk through my notes on chapter 12. So there's going to be two videos on Exodus chapter 12 because it's such an important chapter. So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month will be for you the beginning of months." You're going to mark your calendar by this event, and it shall be the first month of the year for you. And tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, they shall take every man a lamb. Now, notice that the lamb will be taken on the 10th day, according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. The lamb is meant for the entire household. The Passover will be a celebration of the household, okay? And this is really something amazing because the father, the firstborn, would preside. And so, if the household is too small for the lamb, then a man and his neighbor next to his house shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb. Why is this? Because nothing could be left over. Your lamb shall be without blemish. Notice the requirements: without blemish, a male a year old, and you shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now, without blemish, why? Well, all the sacrifices were without blemish, but in a special way, it prepares us to understand the sacrifice of Christ, the true Lamb of God. A male lamb a year old. In other words, it would be at the height of its life, a year old. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month. So you're going to take the lamb, you're going to keep it for 4 days. This would allow time to really inspect the lamb and make sure that it had no flaw and no blemish as well. And so when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel, okay, shall kill the lamb in the evening. And so this sacrifice, when is the lamb going to be slain? In the evening on the 14th day of the month. The month is going to be Nisan, not the car Nissan, Nisan with one S, okay, not two. And it's the month of Nisan. And then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two door posts, so on the sides of the door and the lintel of the houses. So you're going to mark the top of the door and the sides of the door in which they eat them. So only where you eat the lamb will the house be marked. Now, this is very important. They have to eat the lamb and the house has to be marked. You only mark the houses where you eat the Passover lamb. Notice the connection between being marked with the blood and also eating the lamb. Why is this important? It's preparing us to understand the Last Supper of Jesus and the cross. Jesus is going to celebrate the Last Supper when he's celebrating the Jewish Passover. In verse 8, it says, "They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it." Now, why bitter herbs? You're probably thinking, what's the reason for the bitter herbs? It's supposed to remind them of their bitter suffering. It reminds them of the bitter suffering that the Lord took them out of in Egypt. Now, the unleavened bread is important too because the Passover is the first day of 8 days. The next 7 days will be a feast of unleavened bread. So they're going to eat the Passover the first day and then celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the days that follow. So they're eating it with unleavened bread. And this is also important because it was Jesus who took the unleavened bread at the Last Supper and he said, "This is my body," when he gave us the Holy Eucharist. So notice the connections here between eating the lamb in the house that's marked and then eating it with unleavened bread. Do not eat it raw or boiled with water, but roasted, its head with its legs, its inner parts, and you shall let none of it remain until the morning. So this Passover lamb has been consecrated, it's set apart for only one thing, and that's the Passover. You can't, you can't take it, you can't take it with you. You can't leave it for the Egyptians. If you leave it, you have to burn it, okay? Nothing can be left for the Egyptians because it's only set apart for this purpose. Anything that remains until the morning, you shall burn, okay? It's only used for the Passover. You either eat it or burn it completely. In this manner you shall eat it. Notice the manner. With your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. Now, why this instruction here? In other words, they're going to eat it preparing to leave immediately from Egypt. So the concept of the Passover and the Exodus are, as you might say, inextricably bound together. You can't separate them. That's why they had to eat it with their loins girded. That means you're basically ready to go. Sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you're going to eat it in haste. And so just imagine they're eating it ready to go at any moment. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Now, notice that every firstborn, man and beast, is going to die. This would really be a definitive sign to the Egyptians of this plague. And if you remember when Moses went to Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 4, 21 to 23, he went with the message, Israel is my firstborn son. Let my son go, or I will slay your firstborn sons. And so here's the fulfillment of that great prophecy in Exodus chapter 4, 21 to 23. And he goes on and he says, after he says that both man and beast will die, all firstborn, man and beast will die, he says that, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute my judgment. I am the Lord. Now, this phrase of executing God's judgment upon the gods of Egypt, it's very important because when you look at the plagues, the people of Egypt had gods associated with everything: the Nile, the gnats, the flies, and so on and so forth. And so many scholars will point out that every plague seems to be God showing that each of the gods of Egypt are powerless in his presence and that he has all dominion. And so, in a sense, he's executing his judgment upon all the gods of Egypt. He's showing the Egyptians that your gods cannot help you, they are of no avail. The one true God of Israel is Lord alone over heaven and earth. And so the Passover is the definitive judgment upon the land of Egypt and upon the gods of Egypt. On all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And even the Pharaoh himself considered himself a representative of a god. And so here's what he says in verse 13: the blood shall be a sign for you. Now, the sign that's really amazing is the blood. Now, why is that important? Because it's the blood of an unblemished lamb. The blood of the unblemished Passover lamb, that's going to be a sign to you. The blood shall be a sign to you upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And no plague shall fall upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. Now, what's beautiful in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, is many times we're told things, but no explanation is given. the people of Israel would leave Egypt, and for generations they would simply say, "We were saved by the Lord, and the blood of the unblemished lamb that was on our doors, it was a sign." And so this is really amazing. They would have to think about that generation after generation, the blood of an unblemished lamb, generation after generation. And then when John the Baptist saw Jesus the first time, you can see this in John chapter 1, verse 29 and John chapter 1, verse 36. What does John say? "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." So this is really amazing if you think about it. The blood of the Lamb is going to be a sign for you. And this sign, the Israelites, as they take their journey through salvation history, they're going to develop a more profound understanding of this sign, the blood of the unblemished lamb, the Passover lamb. And of course, we all know what it's preparing us for. It's preparing us for Jesus, the true Passover lamb who would give his life for the salvation of the world. And so verse 14 says, "This day shall be for you a memorial day." In other words, you're going to continue to celebrate this feast day. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. You're going to keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, you shall observe it as an ordinance forever. And so this is really important, these words here, because in the New Testament, many people forget this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, St. Paul says, "Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Therefore, keep the feast." He's talking about keeping the Passover feast. But what Passover feast is he talking about? He's talking about celebrating the Eucharist. That's what he's talking about. And he picks up on this conversation in 1 Corinthians chapters 10 and 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So when you go back and you look at this, this will be a perpetual feast. You can understand what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, when he says, "Christ our Passover has been sacrificed, therefore keep the feast." Okay? Verse 15, 7 days you shall eat the unleavened bread. So you're going to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. So this is often known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And notice how it's connected to the Passover. On the first day, you shall put away leaven out of your houses. So anything that caused the rising of dough was considered leaven. It was more than just yeast. It could be anything that caused dough to rise, okay? So all leaven had to be put out of your houses. "For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel." Now, why is this concept of leaven so important? So many scholars will say that it also has a spiritual concept tied to it, because leaven, as a rising agent, it causes bread to eventually become corrupt and turn green or blue. And if you don't believe me, go to one of those natural food stores and buy some bread that has no preservatives at all and just leave it in your kitchen for 7 days, and you'll see what I mean. That bread will start to turn all kinds of different colors because of the leaven that's in the bread. It causes it to eventually become corrupted. And so leaven in itself became a sign of corruption. You can see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul talks about this. He talks about this in a spiritual sense. And so the command is take all leaven out of the household. Okay. And so you're going to eat unleavened bread. Now, unleavened bread, that can endure a long time. And it's really amazing. If you consider, the hosts that we use for mass, which are unleavened as well, they can last for even years and nothing happens to them. As long as that you don't get water on them, they're good to go. That's really amazing. And so eventually this became associated with with spiritual corruption over time. And we might get into that a little bit in the notes when we go through the notes. So in chapter 12, verse 16, it says, "On the first day you shall hold an assembly, and on the seventh day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on these days. But what everyone must eat, that only may be prepared for you. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on this very day I brought your host out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an ordinance forever." And so some of the vocabulary gets a little confusing here for maybe first time readers of the Bible, because the feast of unleavened bread and the Passover are linked together. You see this in the Old Testament, and you especially see this in the Gospels in the New Testament. So be aware of this when you're reading the Gospels, because it will often use them almost as synonyms, okay? And that will help you to understand when it talks about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's actually also talking about the Passover when you're reading some of the Gospel narratives. So in verse 18, it says, "In the first month of the 14th day of the month at the evening, you shall eat unleavened bread. So until the 21st day of the month in the evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel." Now, this is pretty strict right here, where whether he is a sojourner or a native in the land, you shall eat nothing leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Select lambs for yourself according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb." Now notice that the lamb had to be slain. "Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood which is in the basin, and touch the lintel of the two doorposts with the blood which is in the basin." Now, this is really something amazing. If you know anything about hyssop, it's a very interesting plant. It has these green leaves and kind of like a purple flower, a purple stem with flowers on it that grows. It's not a super strong plant. It's very tender as a plant. And imagine they would take the hyssop and dip it in the blood, and it had to be with hyssop that they would apply the blood on the side of the door and on the top of the door. I really find it interesting that it's a purple flower, and I find it kind of interesting. It's purple, and how interesting that we wear purple during Lent and also Advent. Okay, so that's really kind of maybe just a beautiful coincidence, you could say. But that hyssop, it's just like, why did God command this plant of all plants? That's a good question. "And none of you should go out of the door of his house until the morning." So this command to stay in the house is very important. What does it remind you of? It reminds you of the ark. If you remember the ark of Noah, and obviously, Noah and his family were sealed in that ark. They couldn't leave until they finally went through the flood. In a similar manner, no one can go outside of the house. The house will be marked with the blood of the Lamb, and you will be inside eating the Passover, and no one will go out until morning. For the Lord will pass through to slay the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel of the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your house to slay you. That's really amazing. They would be saved by the blood of the Lamb, and you had to be in the house. You couldn't leave. You had to eat the Passover there at that house. "You shall observe this rite as an ordinance for you and for your sons forever." And okay, so this will be a perpetual memorial. "And when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service." So they will celebrate the Passover. When you go to Joshua chapter 5, you'll see how this actually happens when they get in the promised land. They celebrate the Passover, and the manna ceases after they celebrate the Passover and eat the fruits of the land. Joshua chapter 5. "And when your children say to you, 'What do you mean by this service?' you shall say, 'It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover.'" Now, notice how the Passover is a feast, but also it's a sacrifice. Very important to look at the background. It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he has passed over the houses of the people of Egypt when he slew the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshiped. Now, this reminds us of what the people did in Exodus chapter 4 at the end of the chapter when they bowed down and worshiped, and then they rebelled after that. And here they are bowing down and worshiping again. And you know what's going to happen. Well, it's not going to take too long for the complaining to start. When you go to Exodus 14, you'll find that. So it goes on and it says, then the people of Israel went and did so as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. At midnight, the Lord smote the firstborn of Egypt and the firstborn of all the Pharaoh who sat on the throne. And the Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where one was not dead. And he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, rise up and go forth from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you said, be gone, and bless me also. And I love this last phrase, bless me also. It's like the Pharaoh is saying, just get out of here and bless me also. And the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we are dead men. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their mantles on their shoulders. And the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked of the Egyptians jewelry of silver and of gold and clothing. Now, all of this would be used ideally for the tabernacle. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sights of the Egyptians so that they let them have what they asked. Thus, they despoiled the Egyptians, okay? Similar to the patriarchs. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude went with them. Now, this is really interesting, a mixed multitude. So it seems that there were some Gentiles that also went with them, and with them very many cattle and flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry. Neither had they prepared for themselves any provisions. So, they're just taking the unleavened bread with them. They're not preparing anything else. The time that the people dwelt in the land of Egypt was 430 years. Notice the time period here. And at the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. You had to be circumcised. No sojourner or hired servant may eat of it. In one house shall it be eaten. You shall not carry forth any of the flesh outside of the house. You shall not break a bone of it. Now, not breaking a bone of it's very important, because in John's gospel, we're told that not a bone of Jesus was broken. And so many scholars see this as a reference back to Psalm 34, which has a similar line, and also to the Passover Lamb. In a special way, John wants to associate Jesus with the Passover Lamb. Not a bone was broken. And so all the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover of the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Notice how they have to be circumcised. and they have to be part of the house of Israel. But no uncircumcised person shall eat of the Passover. Now, this is really amazing if you think about it. You have to be of the house of Israel, and if you're a male,